It began in silence, a silence so deep that even the dogs did not bark, the crows did not stir. The wind itself seemed to hesitate. When dawn touched the valley, the sun rose on cottages where smoke should have curled from chimneys, on doors that should have opened to the sound of footsteps and voices, but nothing moved. 200 villagers lay in their beds, eyes closed, bodies still, as though sleep had taken them gently in the night. Yet when neighbors came knocking, when they shook shoulders and called names, no one stirred. Not one. The entire village had fallen into slumber and not a soul awoke again. It was a sight that froze the blood. Families clutched each other in disbelief as they walked through the cottages. Mothers lay beside infants, both motionless, their faces calm. Old men rested in chairs by the fire, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Young men and women sprawled where they had collapsed, caught mid-breath, mid-dream. There was no struggle, no wound, no sign of violence. They looked peaceful, as though caught in a single shared dream. But their skin was cold, their lips pale, their silence eternal. The shock rippled outward. By midday, news reached neighboring farms, and by evening, travelers carried the tale to distant towns. A village gone quiet, 200 souls lost not by blade, not by fire, but by sleep itself. Priests called it a judgment, a punishment from God for sins unknown. Physicians searched for poisons, for strange herbs, for sickness in the air. But none could explain how so many had perished together, without struggle, without sound, without warning. To this day, the tragedy defies reason. Some claim the villagers were cursed, victims of an ancient oath whispered by their ancestors. Others speak of a poisoned feast, a drink shared among them all, though no vessel was ever found. And some whisper of darker things, that the village lay on a wound in the earth, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and that something beyond sleep called their souls away. The ruins of that village still stand, crumbled walls hidden beneath weeds, its paths swallowed by moss. Travelers who pass through report the same strange silence, a hush heavier than solitude, as if the earth itself remembers the night it held 200 sleepers in its arms and refused to let them go. And in winter, when the fog hangs thick and the air smells faintly of smoke though no fire burns, locals swear they hear faint breathing from the cottages, the sound of sleepers not yet done with their dreams. But those who linger too long in that silence often feel their own eyelids grow heavy, as though something unseen invites them to join the eternal slumber. That is why even now, centuries later, the valley is avoided. Maps mark it, but travelers look away, their eyes sliding past its name. For who can bear to walk where 200 lives ended in silence, where sleep itself became the executioner, where a tragedy without witness became timeless? To understand the tragedy of the 200 villagers who slept and never woke again, we must first look closely at the valley itself, a place where history and myth were braided together long before the night of silence. The village sat cradled between two jagged ridges in a remote corner of Eastern Europe, though no map today dares to name it directly. Generations ago, settlers carved their homes from stone and timber, building cottages that huddled close to one another for warmth and safety. At the center stood a weathered church, its bell tower leaning slightly from centuries of storms, its cracked bell still tolling faithfully every dawn and dusk. Life here was simple, bound by the seasons, the soil, and the rituals that had defined the community for more than 300 years. They farmed barley and rye, kept goats and sheep, baked bread in communal ovens, and gathered in the churchyard for festivals. Outsiders who visited often marveled at the harmony of the people, their songs echoing through the valley in spring when planting began, and their laughter rising in autumn when harvest filled their barns. It was, to the casual eye, a place untroubled by time. Yet beneath that image of peace lay a history of unease, passed down in whispers from elders to children. The valley, according to old tales, had once been the site of a village that vanished centuries earlier, consumed by a sickness no physician could name. Travelers wrote of arriving to find doors open, meals half-eaten, tools left in fields, and no living soul to explain the absence. Some believed the people had fled into the mountains, driven by madness or fear. Others insisted they had fallen to a curse laid upon the land by those who came before. Whatever the truth, the valley remained empty for nearly a century before new settlers braved it again, hoping the earth had forgotten its anger. The villagers who later called it home carried with them both resilience and superstition. They knew that life in such isolation demanded respect for unseen forces, so they marked their days with rituals meant to appease whatever lingered in the soil or air. Salt was scattered at thresholds every new year. Children were forbidden to whistle after sundown, lest they call what could not be sent away. And when one died, The villagers placed a small stone beneath the tongue of the deceased before burial. A custom, they said, prevented restless spirits from whispering in dreams. These customs were not written in books. They lived only in memory, enforced by fear rather than logic. Outsiders dismissed them as quaint, but for the villagers they were as vital as sowing seeds or mending roofs. Over time, however, faith in these traditions waned. By the early 1800s, a younger generation began questioning the old ways. They mocked the elders' superstitions, laughing at the salt scattered across doorways or the stones pressed into the mouths of the dead. The Enlightenment had reached even these remote hills in fragments, carried in books and sermons, urging people to trust reason over fear. For some, this was liberation. For others, it was folly. Arguments broke out between families who clung to tradition and those who abandoned it. The church, once the anchor of unity, found itself at the heart of these tensions. Priests warned that forsaking the old rituals would invite darkness, but their words were met with skepticism. By the time the year of the tragedy arrived, the village was divided not by violence, but by indifference. People lived side by side, yet one half held salt and prayer close, while the other placed their faith only in the visible, the tangible, the practical. On the surface, life continued as it always had. Crops planted, animals tended, marriages celebrated, funerals mourned. But underneath lingered a subtle fracture, invisible to outsiders yet heavy in the hearts of those who remembered the whispers of history. And still the valley itself bore reminders. Travelers sometimes spoke of unease when camping near its edges. Birds avoided its trees during winter, leaving them unnervingly silent. Snow seemed to fall heavier here than in neighboring regions, muffling sound until the whole world seemed asleep. The villagers, hardened by generations, grew accustomed to these oddities. They explained them away or ignored them altogether, unwilling to dwell on omens. But omens do not vanish simply because men turn their eyes elsewhere. On the night the silence fell, it was as though every forgotten ritual, every abandoned prayer, every neglected precaution came due at once. The valley, some believe, remembered. It remembered the old village that vanished. It remembered the customs broken, the faith mocked. And when the villagers laid down their heads, it claimed them one by one until none were left to tell the story. In truth, we may never know whether the tragedy was born from poison, from plague, or from powers beyond comprehension. But to grasp why so many see it as more than coincidence, one must first understand the weight of history pressing down on that small, isolated place. A valley with 2 villages gone silent is not merely land. It is a graveyard of memory. That is why the story has survived. Not because of the 200 who perished in one night, but because they were not the first to do so. As the fateful year drew closer to its tragic night, unease began to creep into the daily rhythm of the villagers. It started subtly, so much so that at first no one recognized the threads unraveling. Crops, once steady and reliable, began to wither prematurely in the fields. Barley heads grew thin, stalks brittle, and even the sheep grazing on the hills seemed reluctant to eat the grass, bleating restlessly through the evenings. Farmers muttered to each other about strange discolorations in the soil, patches of earth where nothing would grow, not even weeds. Yet when they dug into the ground, they found nothing unusual. No stones, no pests, no rot. Just earth that seemed unwilling to live. Children, more sensitive than their elders, noticed things others ignored. They complained of hearing faint murmurs when they lay in bed, whispers that came not from their homes but from beyond the walls, drifting through windows that had been latched tight. Some swore the voices called their names, soft and coaxing, as if urging them to rise from their beds and step outside into the dark. Parents dismissed these as bad dreams, yet they too began to wake in the night, not to voices but to silence so complete it felt unnatural. Even the owls and wolves that had always haunted the hills seemed to vanish, leaving the nights hollow and oppressive. The church bell, once dependable, grew unpredictable. At times it refused to ring at dawn, its sound swallowed by a strange heaviness in the air. On other mornings, the bell would toll of its own accord in the dead of night, sending people rushing into the square only to find no hand on the rope, no wind strong enough to sway it. The priest declared it a warning from heaven urging repentance. Skeptics scoffed, blaming rust in the mechanisms or mischievous children. But the unease settled deeper, refusing to be shaken. Superstitions long abandoned returned quietly. Salt began to appear again on thresholds, not just of the elders but of families who had once mocked such practices. Mothers whispered old prayers while tucking children into bed, words they had not spoken in decades. A few even left offerings of bread or milk at the edges of the forest, hoping to soothe whatever force lingered there. Yet just as quickly others doubled down on defiance. Young men mocked the rituals openly, daring whatever curse haunted the valley to strike them. One evening, in a drunken stupor, a group of them carried away the stones placed on the graves in the churchyard and threw them into the river, laughing as they vanished beneath the current. The priest's warnings grew more dire, his sermons fiery, but his congregation dwindled as villagers chose work in the fields over sermons that no longer comforted. Divisions deepened until the village was no longer merely fractured, but quietly hostile, neighbor against neighbor, each side certain the other was summoning disaster. Rumors spread of animals found dead in the fields, not from wolves or sickness, but lying peacefully, as if they too had simply fallen asleep and refused to wake. Shepherds whispered that some of their flocks stared at them with strange glazed eyes, before collapsing in silence. A farmer's wife, rising before dawn, swore she saw a figure standing in the square draped in black, unmoving, its face hidden beneath a hood. When she called out, the figure did not move, and when she took a step closer, it dissolved into mist. Few believed her, yet others began to recall seeing shadows at the edges of their sight, shapes in windows, figures at crossroads, that disappeared the moment they were confronted. Fear bred tension, and tension bred desperate acts. Some villagers begged the priest to conduct nightly vigils in the church, filling the nave with candlelight and prayers until morning. Others demanded practical solutions. More guards in the square, stricter patrols of the fields. A few quietly considered abandoning the valley altogether, whispering about relatives in distant towns who might take them in. But leaving meant abandoning land, homes, animals, everything that tied them to their ancestors. And so, despite their fears, they stayed. As the nights grew colder, dreams took on a new intensity. People woke drenched in sweat, claiming to have dreamt of entire crowds standing at their bedside, silent and watching. Children cried in their sleep, whispering words in languages no one recognized. A merchant passing through the valley was so disturbed by what he saw, pale faces, hollow eyes, a silence in the streets that felt like mourning, that he cut his visit short, vowing never to return. He told other towns along his route that the village was cursed, that it was already dying. By winter, an oppressive weight seemed to hang over the entire community. Fires burned low despite fresh logs, bread spoiled faster than it should, and even laughter sounded thin, forced, as if no one remembered how to be joyful without effort. Some swore the very air had thickened, pressing against their lungs, making every breath a labor. When the year turned and the bells rang for the new year, they did not sound like celebration but like warning. The villagers tried to brush away the unease with feasts and dancing, but even the children played quietly, their eyes too old for their years. And so, the village carried on, bound by habit, duty, and denial, all the while sensing something unseen, something vast, circling closer with every passing night. They would continue their routines, milking goats, baking bread, tending fields, because to stop would be to admit what they already feared, that they were living not in safety, but in the waiting shadow of an ending. It happened on a night that seemed at first like any other. The villagers had gone about their day as usual, tending to animals, mending tools, and preparing their evening meals. Children played in the square until the last sliver of sun slipped behind the ridges, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys as families gathered indoors. Winter clung to the valley, and the chill in the air drove people to their hearths early. By nightfall, every door was bolted, every candle burned low, and silence spread across the village like a shroud. Yet there was something different, something that none could name but all could feel. The air seemed thicker than usual, heavy and stifling, as though it resisted the lungs that tried to draw it in. Even the flames in the hearths flickered strangely, rising tall one moment and nearly dying the next without cause or draft. Outside, the night was utterly still. No wind, no rustling of trees, no call of night birds. It was as if the valley itself was holding its breath. One by one, the villagers retired to their beds. Mothers tucked children under wool blankets, fathers banked fires, and elders whispered prayers to gods they no longer wholly believed in. Some muttered the old words, placing salt at their windowsills as their grandparents once had. Others scoffed at such things, closing their eyes with the arrogance of certainty. But whether faithful or skeptical, all laid their heads upon their pillows, never to rise again. In the hours after midnight, an unnatural quiet fell so deep it seemed to seep into the bones of the sleepers. Dreams took hold swiftly, dragging every soul into a shared abyss. Some would later say they dreamt of a field of endless snow, where figures stood frozen, their faces blank and their hands reaching out. Others claimed they dreamt of the old church bell tolling without end, its sound so loud it shattered the stars. Still others swore they saw their ancestors lined up in silent rows, beckoning them forward into darkness. But these are only fragments, retold by those who claim visions in the aftermath, for in truth no one awoke to describe their final sleep. What is known is this: when dawn came, the bell did not toll. No children ran into the square. No smoke rose from chimneys. Doors remained shut but not locked. Meals sat half-prepared on tables, loaves of bread only half-sliced, pots of porridge still cooling. Beds were filled, every single one with lifeless bodies that appeared untouched by violence. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Each villager lay as if in peaceful slumber, their faces calm, their hands folded or resting at their sides. The only strangeness was their eyes. Though closed, faint discoloration ringed their lids, a bruised shadow that gave the impression of long exhaustion. When a traveling trader arrived later that morning, he found the village eerily still. His cartwheels echoed too loudly in the empty streets. He called out expecting laughter or greetings, but only his voice replied. At last he entered a home, pushing open an unlocked door, and what he saw inside froze his blood. A family of 5 lay in their beds motionless. He rushed to another house and another, only to find the same. Everywhere he looked there were bodies. Old, young, rich, poor, all caught in the same eternal sleep. Not a single soul stirred. The trader fled in terror, his cart abandoned, his horse whipped to exhaustion as he sped to the nearest town. When he told his tale, few believed him at first, but curiosity and fear drove officials, priests, and villagers from neighboring valleys to investigate. They too found the same sight. 200 souls gone in a single night with no sign of violence, no sickness apparent, no reason that the living could grasp. The church, once the heart of the community, stood silent. The great bell rope hung still, though some swore they felt it trembling under their hands, as if it had rung through the night when no one was there to hear. The altar candles, left burning, had guttered out long before, leaving trails of wax hardened like frozen tears. The graveyard, too, seemed to bear witness. The fresh stones placed on recent burials had been disturbed. Some shifted as though lifted by unseen hands. In the square, the footprints of villagers remained, but none crossed beyond the borders of the village. It was as if, once night fell, none were permitted to leave. Word spread quickly, carried by rumor and fear. Some whispered of a plague unknown to medicine, a sickness that killed without fever or wound. Others spoke of poisoned wells, though no taste of bitterness lingered in the water. But most clung to the explanation whispered since the valley's first settlement, that the land was cursed, that it had claimed the people as it had once before. Priests conducted hurried rites, sprinkling holy water on thresholds, reading psalms over the lifeless forms, but no spirit stirred. Physicians examined the bodies, but no explanation satisfied their eyes. The people had simply ceased to wake, as if death had come in the form of sleep itself, gentle and merciless. As night fell once more, fear overtook those who had come to investigate. None would stay within the village after sundown, and so the dead were left where they lay, abandoned to their silence. A handful of brave men returned days later to attempt burial, but they could not dig fast enough for 200 graves. In the end, the bodies were left in their homes, the doors sealed, the valley abandoned once again. And so the climax of the story burned itself into memory. 200 villagers, asleep forever. Their breath stolen not by violence but by the quiet hand of something unseen. The valley, once alive with laughter and toil, had fallen into silence deeper than any grave, a silence that would never fully lift. The discovery of the sleeping dead spread like wildfire across the region. By the time news reached the larger towns, fear had already taken root. Officials, priests, and physicians were summoned to the valley in waves, each desperate to uncover what had happened, each hoping to tame the rising tide of panic. Yet with every investigation, the questions only deepened. The first group to arrive after the trader's report entered cautiously, crossing themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. The silence was the first thing they noted. No dogs barked, no birds sang. Even the crunch of boots on frozen earth seemed muffled, swallowed by the air itself. When they entered the cottages, they found the villagers exactly as described, lying in their beds, their bodies preserved as though merely sleeping. Faces calm, limbs relaxed, no rictus of pain, no contortions of struggle. Physicians pressed ears to chest, but no heartbeats stirred. They checked pulses, examined eyes, searched for signs of poison or plague. They found nothing. It was as if 200 souls had been gently lifted from their bodies in unison, leaving shells behind. Panic gripped the investigators. Some fled, refusing to spend another night in the valley. Those who remained attempted to carry out proper burials, but the sheer number overwhelmed them. 200 graves could not be dug quickly, not in frozen winter soil. Instead, they made the decision to seal the cottages. Doors were bolted, windows boarded. The dead remained within their homes, entire families entombed in the places where they had lived, laughed, and now lay in eternal slumber. The church became the central site of mourning. Priests held ceremonies, sprinkling holy water, chanting psalms into the empty air. Yet each prayer echoed too loudly, bouncing from stone walls as though the building itself was hollow, abandoned by the divine. The church bell, once a symbol of time's passage, hung mute, as if it too had succumbed to the silence. The graveyard was left untouched. None dared disturb the earth where stones had shifted strangely before. Instead, crosses were hastily erected in the square, each meant to stand for those who could not be buried. It was a gesture more symbolic than practical, for no rite could contain the weight of 200 lost at once. Rumors began to spiral out of control. Some whispered that the villagers had been punished for abandoning their old traditions, that their refusal to honor the rituals had invited retribution. Others swore they had angered the land itself, which demanded a sacrifice to quench its hunger. Physicians attempted to calm the hysteria, with talk of natural causes. Tainted air trapped in the valley, perhaps, or a sickness that struck only those who slept. But these explanations failed to convince. If it was air, why did livestock survive? If it was sickness, why did bodies show no sign of disease? And why, above all, had death come to all at once in a single night? Fear spread beyond the valley. Neighboring villages emptied their wells, burned their bedding, scrubbed their homes with vinegar, desperate to ward off an invisible plague. Trade routes were rerouted to avoid passing near the cursed land. Maps were quietly redrawn, the valley marked not with names but with warnings. No one wished to say it aloud, but the land had become a scar, and no living soul desired to cross it. Years passed and still the valley lay abandoned. Cottages, once warm with hearths, decayed slowly, roofs collapsing, walls bowing. Windows stared blankly, dark eyes and hollow skulls. The church crumbled, its bell tower eventually collapsing in a storm, the bell buried beneath stone and dust. Yet locals swore that on some nights, the sound of tolling still drifted faintly through the air, as though the buried bell remembered its purpose. Children in nearby towns were warned never to stray too far east, lest they stumble into the cursed valley. Mothers told them that if they listened closely at night, they might hear the whispers of the sleeping villagers, calling for company in their endless slumber. Travelers gave the place a wide berth, some claiming they saw lights flickering in abandoned cottages, others swearing they heard voices chanting in languages no living tongue could replicate. For some, curiosity outweighed fear. Scholars, priests, and the occasional charlatan ventured into the valley seeking answers. Some returned, pale and shaken, speaking of a heaviness that pressed on their chests until they fled. Others returned, claiming to have heard the sound of hundreds breathing in unison, though the houses were empty. A few did not return at all, and their names were added to the whispers of the place. The tragedy became legend, but it was not forgotten. Every generation passed it down, reshaping the tale but never erasing its core truth, that 200 villagers lay down to sleep and never woke again. Over time, the valley came to be known not by its original name, but by titles whispered with dread. The Silent Village, the Sleeper's Rest, the Grave of Dreams. No crops grew there anymore, no birds nested in its trees. Snow seemed to fall heavier, and mist clung stubbornly to its hollows, as if the land itself wished to hide its shame. For historians, the event remained a wound in the record. No explanation satisfied. Was it mass poisoning? A gas release from beneath the earth? A psychological contagion? Some collective surrender of will? None could say. And so the story lingered not as history but as warning. Parents spoke of it to frighten children into obedience. Priests spoke of it to remind congregations of the wages of sin. And wanderers spoke of it in hushed tones by firelight, shivering as if the valley's silence still reached for them from afar. Yet through all the theories and all the fear, one truth endured above all others. The valley was abandoned, left to crumble into ruins, its cottages filled with shadows, its graves unmarked, its people forever trapped in that final sleep. No one dared reclaim it, no one dared disturb it, and so it remains, a scar upon the land, a graveyard without graves, a silence without end. For generations after the valley was sealed, its silence became more than memory. It became obsession. Scholars, priests, and wanderers returned again and again, each seeking answers to the riddle that defied time. Yet the closer they looked, the deeper the mystery grew. Early investigators clung to the hope of a rational cause. Physicians examined samples of soil, wood, and even fragments of food left uneaten on tables. No trace of poison was ever found. Wells were tested, their water drawn and consumed by outsiders, yet none fell ill. Air samples were taken, though the science of the age could barely scratch the surface of such study. No evidence of contamination appeared. Bodies, though long buried or sealed within houses, revealed nothing under examination. No signs of plague, no unusual markings beyond the faint bruising around the eyes. It was as though life had simply been stolen in unison, clean and without trace. This confounded doctors, but for the faithful, it proved what they had long claimed, that the tragedy was not of man's making but of forces unseen. Priests pointed to the abandoned rituals, the mockery of traditions, the defilement of graves. They declared the event a judgment, a divine strike against arrogance, yet even they could not explain why children and infants, too young to sin, were taken with the rest, nor why livestock survived, grazing peacefully among the ruins after their masters had gone. Folklore, however, offered darker theories. Some spoke of the valley as cursed ground, a place where blood had been spilled long before the first settlers came. Ancient wars, forgotten massacres, sacrifices made in the shadows. Such tales grew in detail with each retelling, as if imagination filled the silence left by fact. Others whispered that the valley was not cursed but hungry, that every few centuries it demanded a toll in lives, swallowing entire villages into its sleep. The earlier settlement that vanished seemed proof enough. If it happened once, why not again? Some even claimed that the villagers were not truly dead, but trapped in dreams so deep they could not return. A few who dared spend a night near the ruins reported hearing sighs carried on the wind, as though hundreds still breathed in rhythm below the earth. One traveler swore he saw candlelight glowing faintly in the windows of collapsed cottages, flickering as if carried by unseen hands. When he approached, the lights vanished, leaving only darkness and the echo of his own heartbeat. Scientists of later centuries proposed new theories, some grounded in geology. They suggested that the valley might rest atop hidden fissures, capable of releasing gases such as carbon monoxide, odorless and lethal, which could lull an entire population into sleep before suffocating them. It was possible, they said, that shifting stone or volcanic pockets beneath the earth released a deadly cloud that settled into the village like a blanket. Yet even this theory raised questions. If the gas killed in a single night, why did no animals perish? Goats, sheep, and dogs were found alive after the event, wandering confused but unharmed. Could a gas truly choose between man and beast? Others speculated about ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and can induce hallucinations, seizures, or death. But ergot rarely kills all at once and never so silently. It brings madness, thrashing visions, not quiet sleep. The villagers had left no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no claw marks on walls. Their deaths had been as orderly as their lives. Paranormal researchers, centuries later, clung to the supernatural. They claimed the valley was a thin place, where the veil between worlds weakened, allowing something from beyond to pass through. Perhaps the villagers were not taken by disease but by hands unseen, drawn into a realm where they remained, neither living nor dead. Some psychics who dared to enter reported overwhelming waves of exhaustion, a pull to lie down and never rise. One insisted she heard voices calling from beneath the soil, hundreds murmuring in unison, "Sleep with us. Stay." Locals continued to avoid the valley. Hunters spoke of mist that lingered too long, mist that seemed to follow them as they left. Travelers camped miles away swore they heard a bell tolling faintly at midnight, though the tower had collapsed long before. Children in nearby towns played cruel games, daring one another to run to the edge of the valley and return with proof. Many came back pale, unable to describe why they had fled so quickly. Some never returned at all. Over time, the mystery only deepened because it refused to resolve. Every theory cracked under scrutiny. Science offered explanations that accounted for some details, but not all. Faith offered judgments but ignored innocence. Folklore explained much but demanded belief in forces most dismissed. The tragedy sat at the crossroads of history and myth, untouched by certainty. And so the valley remained as it always had, abandoned, avoided, feared. Cottages decayed into skeletons, their beams jutting like ribs from the earth. The church bell lay buried, though its toll was still heard. The square, once alive with laughter, now echoed only with the rustle of leaves. And beneath it all, beneath stone and soil, 200 villagers lay in their endless slumber, a riddle to all who dared remember them. No one could say what had taken them. No one could say if it would happen again. That was the true terror of the mystery. Not only that 200 lives had ended in silence, but that no explanation could protect those who remained. If it could happen once and twice before that, what was to stop it from happening again? And when it did, who would be next? The valley where 200 villagers lay in their endless sleep did not vanish from history. It remained, stubborn and silent, like a wound the earth refused to heal. Generations passed, but whispers clung to it the way ivy clings to stone. Some spoke of it in hushed tones, others turned it into fireside tales, and a few carried its memory across borders as a warning to the living. Yet no one could erase the terror of what had happened there. The tragedy was not just about the dead, it was about the questions that survived them. Why did they sleep and never wake? Why only them? And why in such a way that made death look like peace? Every traveler who came left with more questions than answers, and that is how the valley became not just a place of death, but of obsession. Even centuries later, its silence weighed on all who entered. To walk among the ruins was to feel unwelcome, as if unseen eyes followed each step. Stones seemed to carry memory, air seemed too heavy to breathe, and the wind itself whispered of what it had seen. For some, the tragedy was proof of divine wrath. Priests pointed to it as a sermon in stone. Disrespect the sacred, and you will be silenced. They reminded their followers that the valley's people had mocked traditions, broken covenants, and laughed at warnings. Their punishment, swift and merciless, was a lesson carved into history. To the faithful, the tragedy was a reminder that life was fragile, that arrogance drew consequences beyond measure. Others, less pious, turned to fear rather than faith. Folk tales spread like wildfire. Children were told that if they stayed out too late, the valley would take them into its dream. Lovers whispered that the place was cursed by jealousy, that even happiness could not bloom in its soil. Travelers claimed the mist that clung to its fields carried sleep in its breath, luring anyone who lingered too long. These stories grew, twisting into shapes darker than fact, until the valley became not just a tragedy but a legend. With time, scholars tried to reclaim the tale from superstition. They mapped the land, examined the ruins, and combed through records. Their books were filled with theories of gases, toxins, or unknown diseases. Some made sense, others less so. But all agreed on one point: no evidence was ever enough. Every explanation had cracks, and in those cracks, fear grew like weeds. People realized something terrifying, that some mysteries resist answers and no amount of science, faith, or imagination can cage them. And so the story of the 200 did not fade. It traveled, told in whispers and in ink, carried across taverns, churches, and classrooms. Each telling changed a little, but one detail never shifted. The villagers went to sleep and never woke. That stark truth could not be reshaped. It remained like a scar. For those who lived nearby, the valley became both curse and pride. They hated the association, hated that strangers came to gape at ruins, yet they also knew the story gave them a kind of immortality. The tragedy tied them to something larger than themselves, a mystery no one else could claim. Some protected the tale like guardians, warning outsiders to leave it alone. Others exploited it, weaving it into songs and festivals, feeding travelers stories for coin. But no matter how it was used, the core of the story remained untouchable. Night after night, when silence deepened, families locked their doors and old ones muttered prayers. Some claimed they heard the faint sound of breathing, as though the 200 were still there, not dead, but dreaming beneath the soil. As centuries passed, ruins turned to rubble and rubble to earth. Grass grew over collapsed homes, moss claimed stone walls, and the outlines of cottages blurred into the land. The church bell, once buried, rusted into silence. Only faint mounds and shadows in the earth marked where life had once thrived. Yet the land never returned to ordinary use. Farmers refused to plow it, travelers avoided camping there, and no one dared rebuild. It was as though the ground itself held a warning, whispering, "Not here, never again." Still, some could not resist. Adventurers came with courage, skeptics with arrogance, seekers with desperation. They all left changed. A few claimed to feel nothing, but most admitted an unease, a pull to lie down, to rest, to give in. Some described dreams so vivid they woke trembling, certain they had slept alongside the 200, even if only for a night. Others swore they saw shadows of figures moving through the mist, faces half remembered, eyes closed yet watching. Not all who visited returned with words. A handful never returned at all. Their names were added to the whispers, their disappearances explained with a shrug. The valley took them. Whether truth or rumor, the legend grew stronger with each loss. In the end, the tragedy of the 200 became something greater than history. It became a mirror for all who told it. To the faithful, it proved divine wrath. To scientists, it mocked the limits of knowledge. To storytellers, it was a canvas for fear. To locals, it was both burden and power. And to the world, it was a reminder that not all questions can be answered. There are mysteries that remain mysteries no matter how many centuries pass. The valley stood as proof of that truth. The story never ended because it could not. Every time it was told, it began again, drawing new ears, new fears, new imaginings. The 200 villagers, nameless now but never forgotten, still lay in their endless slumber. Perhaps they rest peacefully, perhaps they dream, or perhaps, as some whisper, they wait. And that is the final terror of the story. Not just what happened, but the possibility that it could happen again. For if a valley could claim 200 lives in silence once, twice, or even more, what is to stop it from opening its arms again? And when it does, who among the living will hear the call to sleep and never wake?